It was just another regular day, until I came home and felt the ground shift beneath me. My heart pounded as I took in the horrifying sight before me. My trees, my beautiful, decades-old trees, were gone. Not pruned, not trimmed, but cut down entirely, reduced to mere stumps littering my once green yard like gravestones of something that should never have been destroyed. The fresh scent of cutwood lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp sting of outrage rising in my chest. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Who would dare trespass onto my private property and do something like this? Then, my eyes landed on the culprit, a pickup truck parked smugly on the street, emblazoned with the HOA logo. A cold wave of fury settled over me. It was them. The HOA had invaded my land, decided my trees had no right to exist, and acted without my consent, without my knowledge, without a shred of legal justification. For a long moment, I stood frozen, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This wasn't some misunderstanding. It was a blatant violation, a challenge, a statement. They wanted to prove a point, to make an example out of me. I wasn't about to let that happen. Taking a slow breath, I turned toward the HOA truck, and there she was, the president of the association, stepping out with a smug little smile, arms crossed as if she had been waiting for my outburst. "Ah, I'm so glad you're here," she said in that sickeningly sweet voice that masked nothing but arrogance. We were just adjusting the aesthetics of the community. Your trees weren't up to HOA standards. I stared at her, silent. She wanted me to lose my temper, to yell, to give her a reason to paint me as the problem. But I wasn't going to play her game. Instead, I smiled. A small, cold, knowing smile. "I see," I said, my voice calm. So let me get this straight. You trespassed onto my property, without permission, and cut down my trees because you personally decided they didn't fit the standards? She blinked, momentarily thrown off by my measured tone. For a second, I saw the confidence in her eyes flicker. But she recovered quickly. "Not quite," she replied, straightening her posture. The HOA has authority over the neighborhood's aesthetics, and your trees were not in compliance. Everything was done to maintain community harmony. Ah, harmony, that ever-convenient word, always used by those who want to control everything around them. I nodded as if considering her words. "Good," I said. Then you won't mind if I take this to court? The shift in her expression was instant. The smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of doubt, then suspicion. Court? She scoffed, trying to sound unfazed, but her voice wavered just enough for me to catch it. There's no need to take it that far. This was a simple decision by the HOA, well within our rights. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "I'm a federal judge," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. The blood drained from her face. I could have recorded that moment and replayed it for the rest of my life. The once confident stance faltered, her arms slipping from their defensive cross, hands twitching at her sides as realization dawned on her. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you," I continued, taking another slow step forward, committed trespassing. You destroyed private property without authorization. This isn't just an overreach of HOA power. It's a crime. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of the problem she had created for herself. I didn't need to say anything else. I turned and walked back into my house, already knowing exactly what my next steps would be. The anger that had initially clouded my thoughts melted into something sharper, more precise, a cold, calculated energy that came from knowing I had already won before the battle had even begun. HOAs like hers believed they were untouchable, that they could get away with anything under the guise of community standards. But what she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the one person who could tear down her entire operation, legally, efficiently, and without breaking a sweat. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and got to work. The first step, gathering evidence. I pulled up the footage from my security cameras, every moment of their illegal destruction, every truck that entered without permission. The proof was clear. Then, I dug deeper. I scoured the city's public records and found exactly what I had suspected. My property was not legally under the HOA's jurisdiction. They had no authority over my land. Not only had they trespassed, but they had done so without even the flimsy excuse of a contract to back them up. And then, I uncovered something even worse. I started combing through the HOA's financial records, tracing transactions, following the money. What I found was damning. Misappropriated funds, fraudulent landscaping charges, thousands of dollars funneled into personal accounts. This wasn't just a petty abuse of power, this was full-blown financial corruption. I had everything I needed to dismantle the HOA from the inside out. But before I filed anything, I decided to let the storm brew. I spoke to my neighbors, many of whom had long resented the HOA's overreach. When I showed them the financial documents, the fraud, the blatant embezzlement, their outrage was instant. The HOA had been bleeding them dry for years, and now they finally saw the truth. The pressure started mounting. Residents began demanding explanations. The once powerful president, who had strutted through the neighborhood like royalty, now avoided leaving her house. And I hadn't even played my final card yet. When the time came, I struck. I filed formal complaints, launched investigations, and let the legal system do what it does best. The government froze the HOA's funds. The fraud was exposed. The lawsuits piled up. And just like that, the woman who thought she could control everything lost everything. The HOA was dissolved. The neighborhood was finally free. And as for her, she sold her house and disappeared, fleeing to the other side of the country in disgrace. I stayed exactly where I was. Because in the end, I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to threaten. I didn't need to play dirty. I simply did what I do best. I used the law against those who think they're above it. And as I stood in my yard, looking at the empty space where my trees once stood, I no longer felt anger. Because in their place, something far greater had taken root. Justice. It started with a letter. A neatly typed, passive-aggressive note taped to my door, laced with words like community standards, violation, and * mandatory compliance. Asterisk at first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, no one would complain about my driveway, which had been the same for years. But then I saw the signature at the bottom. Karen Thompson, HOA president. Ah. Her. I had heard the stories. Everyone in the neighborhood had. Karen ran the HOA like a dictatorship, issuing fines for the most ridiculous infractions. Grass 2 inches too long? $100 fine. A flower bed not aesthetically pleasing? Another fine. And now, apparently, my driveway had made it onto her hit list. I took a deep breath, crumpled the letter in my hand, and knocked on her door. She answered within seconds, as if she had been waiting for me. Her eyes gleamed with that special kind of self-righteousness reserved for people who had just enough power to make others miserable but not enough to actually matter. *O. You must be here about the notice. She smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be friendly. I'm sure you understand, it's just about maintaining the beauty of our community. I held up the crumpled letter. My driveway has been the same for 5 years. And now, suddenly, it's a problem? She folded her arms, tilting her head with practiced condescension. Well, some neighbors have expressed concerns. And as per HOA regulations, which regulation, exactly? I cut in. Karen blinked, clearly not expecting me to challenge her. Excuse me? Which specific regulation states that my driveway is a violation? I asked, keeping my tone calm, measured. She hesitated, then scoffed. I don't have the handbook memorized, but I assure you, it's there. Asterisk. Good, I said, pulling out my phone. Asterisk, let's check. Asterisk. I had already downloaded the HOA bylaws. As I scrolled, Karen's smile wavered. Her fingers twitched at her sides. You don't need to. No mention of driveways, I announced. Asterisk, so either you show me the exact rule I'm supposedly violating, or this fine is invalid. Asterisk. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Asterisk, listen, I'm just trying to ensure the neighborhood looks its best. Surely, you wouldn't want to be the one bringing down property values? Asterisk. Ah, there it was. The classic you're the problem tactic. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and met her gaze. Asterisk, tell you what, Karen. If you find that rule in writing, send it to me. Until then, don't waste paper on another one of these notices. Asterisk. Then, I turned and walked away. She didn't call out. She didn't argue. Because for the first time, someone had pushed back. And she hated it. I had a feeling this wasn't over. But that was fine. I live for battles like this. The room fell silent. The air, once buzzing with casual chatter, now felt heavy, charged with something unspoken yet undeniably powerful. I hadn't expected this. None of us had. Standing in the center of the room, his hands clenched at his sides, Daniel took a deep breath. His eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and determination, met mine. Then, with a voice that barely wavered, he said it. Asterisk, I've been lying to you all. Asterisk. A sharp inhale from the group. A shifting of weight. Nervous glances exchanged. Asterisk, what do you mean? Asterisk, I asked, my own voice cautious. His jaw tightened. He hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it. The weight of whatever he had been carrying was unbearable now. He had reached the breaking point. Asterisk, everything you thought you knew about me, it's not true. Asterisk. A slow, uneasy dread crept over me. What was he saying? Daniel, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Asterisk, you're scaring me. Asterisk. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Asterisk, I should have told you sooner. I wanted to. But I was afraid. Asterisk. Afraid of what? Of losing us? Of what we might think? Of what this revelation would mean for all of us? The weight of his words hung between us like a storm cloud, ready to break. Then tell us now, I said, steadying myself. Asterisk, no more secrets. Asterisk. His eyes locked onto mine. And then he said the words that changed everything. As I sat at my desk, staring at the mess the HOA had left behind through my window, a sense of cold determination settled over me. Anger was useless now. What I needed was precision, patience, and a plan so airtight that there would be no escape for them. They had crossed the line, and I was going to make sure they paid for it in full. The first step was gathering evidence. I pulled up my security camera footage, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Every moment was captured, the HOA trucks rolling up, the workers stepping onto my property, the sound of chainsaws roaring to life. The sight of my beautiful trees collapsing, one by one, sent a fresh wave of fury through me, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about emotions anymore. This was about justice. Next, I dug into the law. As a federal judge, I knew exactly where to look. I combed through city regulations, state laws, and HOA policies. And there it was, the crucial detail I had suspected all along. My property was not under HOA jurisdiction. That meant their actions weren't just overreach, they were outright illegal. Trespassing. Destruction of private property. Violation of environmental laws. The fines alone would be devastating, but I wasn't stopping there. Then came the financial deep dive. If the HOA had the audacity to pull something like this, I knew it wasn't their first abuse of power. I requested public financial records and, within hours, uncovered exactly what I was looking for: misuse of community funds, fraudulent transactions, and blatant embezzlement. They weren't just corrupt, they were drowning in their own crimes. I took a deep breath, a smirk forming as I stacked the evidence into neat piles. I had everything I needed. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Because when I did, there would be no mercy. The room was thick with tension, a palpable silence hanging in the air. I could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the neighbors on me, waiting for the truth to spill out. For weeks, I had quietly compiled the evidence, digging through records and gathering the undeniable proof of the HOA president's corruption. It was time to lay it all bare. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. There would be no turning back now. The woman who had wreaked havoc on my property and so many others in the neighborhood was about to face the consequences of her actions. She thought she was untouchable, the queen of the HOA, but she had made one fatal mistake: she had underestimated me. I stood up slowly, drawing every eye in the room to me. The woman who had been so full of herself only a few weeks ago, parading around with her false authority, was now watching me nervously, her facade cracking. She knew that something was coming, but she had no idea how devastating it would be. With every step I took toward the front, my mind raced. I knew what I was about to do would change everything. I wasn't just exposing her actions, I was about to dismantle her entire empire of control, greed, and manipulation. She had built her reign on lies and intimidation, but now, the truth would come crashing down on her. "I know what you've been doing," I said, my voice firm and controlled. I let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching her face as the color drained from it. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked vulnerable. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was almost poetic. I pulled out the stack of documents I had painstakingly compiled. The truth, neatly organized, was in front of me, a carefully constructed case that would leave no room for excuses. I could see the neighbors start to murmur, confusion and curiosity in their expressions. I could feel the moment of impact drawing near. "These are the financial records of your HOA," I continued, flipping through the papers and pointing at the damning transactions. Asterisk payments made to companies that don't even exist. Money taken from residents without any transparency. These aren't mistakes, this is deliberate. Fraud. Asterisk, I let that sink in before holding up another paper, this one from the town hall. Asterisk, and this is the confirmation that the trees you cut down were removed illegally. This is no longer just about community standards, this is about criminal activity. Asterisk. I could see her posture falter. The woman who had walked through the neighborhood like a queen giving orders, expecting everyone to obey, was now shrinking before the truth. Her hands, which were once so firmly crossed in front of her chest, now trembled at her sides. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere left to hide. The room exploded. It was as if a dam had burst. People shouted, voices rising in anger and disbelief. They had suspected something was wrong, but now they had the evidence in front of them. They demanded answers, demanded accountability. The woman stood there, a deer in headlights, desperately trying to formulate a defense, but her words were empty, hollow. Nothing she said could change the fact that she had been caught. And then, as if it couldn't get worse for her, her phone rang. I watched her face as she answered, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as the conversation went on. I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking now. The government had frozen the HOA's funds. They were under investigation. This wasn't just a bad day for her, it was the end of everything she had worked for. I watched the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was finished. There would be no getting out of this. Her reign was over. And the best part? I hadn't even started to play my hand fully. The moment she crossed the line, I had already prepared everything to ensure her downfall. She had tried to control the neighborhood, to destroy my life, but in the end, I controlled the truth. As I stood there, watching her face crumble, I felt a rush of vindication. It wasn't anger or satisfaction, but the cold, sweet rush of justice served. She had underestimated me, and now she was going to pay the price. The neighbors were no longer afraid of her, no longer intimidated. They had seen the truth, and now, they too wanted answers. The HOA, once an oppressive force in our neighborhood, was about to fall apart. The woman who thought she could control everything had just lost it all. And as I walked out of that room, I knew this was just the beginning of her downfall. The truth was a powerful thing, and once it was unleashed, there was no stopping it. The neighborhood had always seemed to be a peaceful place. But underneath the surface, tensions simmered, quiet murmurs from frustrated residents who felt powerless under the control of the HOA, led by the president who ruled with an iron fist. For years, I kept my distance, maintaining my own peace, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore the wrongs being committed. I had always known that the HOA president, with her false charm and authoritarian rule, was a problem, but I had hoped to stay under the radar. However, that hope was shattered the day I came home to find all my beloved trees destroyed. That moment marked the beginning of something much bigger, a storm that would tear through the neighborhood, exposing the HOA's corruption and the president's tyrannical rule. I knew exactly what I had to do to create the kind of chaos that would unravel everything she had built. I wasn't just going to react with anger. No, I was going to be strategic, methodical, and relentless. I would let her think she had won, all while preparing the perfect storm that would sweep away her false sense of power. I started by talking to a few of the neighbors who had already voiced their frustrations. At first, they had been afraid to stand up to the HOA, too intimidated by the president's authority. But once I shared the evidence I had been gathering, the tide began to shift. I knew I had to approach this carefully, so I took my time. I spoke with just enough neighbors to begin the ripple effect, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion. They started talking to each other, questioning everything the HOA had done, why their fees kept rising, why there were sudden charges they didn't understand, and where all the money was going. I could almost feel the energy shifting in the neighborhood. It was as if a sleeping giant had awoken. For the first time, the residents started to realize they weren't alone in their frustrations. The whispers spread like wildfire, and with each passing day, the community began to unite against the very institution that had controlled them for so long. It was exhilarating to watch, knowing I had started this chain reaction. The tension grew with every conversation, with every neighbor who began to question what had been accepted as normal for so many years. But the real power behind this storm was the financial fraud I had uncovered. I had known something wasn't right about the way the HOA managed the money, and once I dug deeper, it became clear that they had been embezzling funds. Huge sums had been misappropriated, with payments to non-existent companies and questionable transactions made under the table. The HOA had been collecting money from residents under false pretenses, and they had no idea I had the evidence to prove it. Once I started to distribute these financial records, the storm began to pick up speed. The president, once so sure of herself, started to crack. At first, she tried to dismiss the growing unrest, pretending everything was fine, assuring everyone that there was nothing to worry about. But the walls were closing in. Her confident, polished demeanor faltered when the residents started to demand answers. I watched from the sidelines as she tried to maintain control, sending out letters of explanation, holding meetings, and continuing to push her agenda. But the more she spoke, the more the residents began to see through her lies. They realized they had been manipulated for far too long. Then, I made my move. The perfect storm was ready to break. I filed official complaints about the illegal removal of my trees, and when the town hall sent inspectors to investigate, the evidence was irrefutable. They confirmed that the HOA had no right to remove my trees, and the association would be held accountable. But I didn't stop there. I sent all the financial fraud documents to the auditing department, knowing that once the right people got their hands on them, the floodgates would open. By now, the residents were fully on board. They had seen the evidence, they had felt the injustice, and they were ready to stand up. The HOA president's hold over the community was slipping, and she knew it. But even as the storm grew stronger, she refused to back down. The day of the HOA meeting, where she tried to salvage whatever was left of her crumbling authority, I knew it would be the final act. The room was filled with tense residents, all waiting for her to explain herself. But she wasn't prepared for what was coming. I stood up, quietly placing the stack of financial documents in front of her. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked her in the eyes, coldly, without emotion. "You want to talk about the HOA funds?" I said, my voice calm but firm. "Let's talk about them." And then, I laid it all bare, the fraudulent transactions, the misappropriated funds, the missing money. Her face went pale as she tried to come up with an excuse, but it was too late. I had already won. Then, I pulled out the town hall report confirming the illegal removal of my trees, slamming it onto the table. "Here's confirmation that the trees were removed illegally," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "The government is already involved, and the HOA will face a fine of thousands of dollars." The room erupted in anger, and for the first time, the HOA president had nothing to say. The truth had come out, and there was no escaping it. The storm I had created had reached its peak. The HOA president was officially under investigation, and the residents demanded justice. The pressure was too much for her to handle. As news spread, the HOA dissolved, and the president's life began to unravel. Her house was sold, her reputation shattered, and she disappeared without a trace. She had underestimated the power of the law, and she had underestimated me. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and control, was now free. The residents elected a new HOA board, one that represented their interests and didn't manipulate them for profit. And as for me, I stayed in my home, knowing that the storm I had unleashed had not only brought me justice but had also liberated an entire community from the chokehold of a corrupt leader. Looking at the barren yard, where the trees once stood, I no longer felt the anger that had consumed me. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction, a realization that in the place of the trees, something far more important had taken root: justice. For years, the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been the silent, oppressive force in the neighborhood. It presented itself as the arbiter of peace and order, but in truth, it was a deeply corrupt institution that thrived on control, fear, and personal vendettas. I had been living in this neighborhood for a long time, following their endless rules and paying the outrageous fines they imposed without question. At first, I thought it was just part of being a good neighbor. But soon, I started to realize something was wrong. It all started innocuously enough. A minor fine for a slightly overgrown lawn. Then, a charge for leaving a trash can out a few hours past pickup. And then came the letter about my flower garden. It wasn't much, just a few colorful flowers and some small bushes in my front yard, but the HOA deemed it unsightly, and that was enough for them to send a threatening letter demanding that I remove it or face a fine. I was furious. My garden was a source of pride, a little slice of beauty in an otherwise uniform neighborhood. But I wasn't the only one being targeted. As I spoke with my neighbors, it became clear that the HOA was running a reign of terror, fining people for the most trivial things and doing whatever it could to maintain its power over us. At first, I tried to ignore it. I paid the fine for the garden and trimmed my flowers back, all to avoid further confrontation. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't allow the HOA to bully me, or anyone else, any longer. I decided I was going to stand up to them. It wasn't just about my garden anymore, it was about standing up to an unjust system that had caused so much stress, fear, and anger in this community. I began researching, collecting as much information as I could. I talked to neighbors, listened to their stories, and started documenting every unlawful fine, every unjust rule the HOA had imposed. It wasn't easy. Most of my neighbors were too scared to speak out, terrified of the retaliation the HOA was known for. But some of them shared their frustrations with me in whispers. They, too, had had enough. As the weeks went by, a small group of us began to form an underground alliance. At first, we met quietly, exchanging information and discussing our next steps. We knew the HOA was a powerful force, and if we wanted to take it down, we had to be strategic. But as I listened to the stories of my neighbors, How the HOA had taken their money for improvements that were never made, how they had fined them for things as minor as a mailbox out of place or a missing window screen. My resolve only grew stronger. This was no longer just about the fines. It was about exposing the corruption that had infiltrated our community. I reached out to a lawyer who had experience with HOA cases. Together, we reviewed the bylaws, looking for loopholes and violations. It didn't take long for us to uncover disturbing patterns, misappropriated funds, unapproved fees, and a system that worked more like a dictatorship than a neighborhood organization. I had the evidence, but I needed to make sure the community was behind me. I started writing anonymous letters, filled with facts and evidence, exposing the HOA's corruption. It was risky. If the wrong person found out, it could all backfire. But I was too far in now. I couldn't back down. When the letters hit the mailboxes, the reactions were swift and powerful. The neighborhood was in an uproar. For years, people had suffered in silence, afraid to speak out, but now, the truth was out. People began to talk openly about their grievances, and for the first time, they saw that they weren't alone. The community began to unite, and I could see the spark of hope in their eyes. This was the beginning of the end for the HOA. They didn't know it yet, but their days were numbered. But we didn't stop there. The next step was to demand an official audit of the HOA's finances. Armed with all the evidence I had collected, I filed a formal complaint with the state. It was a move that could take months, even years, to see results, but it was a necessary step. When the authorities began investigating, the full extent of the HOA's corruption started to unravel. They had been charging exorbitant fees for non-existent services, mismanaging funds, and funneling money into their own pockets. The community was furious, and the pressure mounted as more and more people came forward to share their stories. In the midst of all this, I kept a low profile. I knew that the HOA would retaliate. They would try to discredit me, destroy my reputation, or intimidate me into backing down. But I wasn't afraid. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I thought about my neighbors, their fear, their frustration, their anger, and I reminded myself that this fight was bigger than me. It was about all of us. The turning point came during one of the HOA's mandatory meetings. The president, a woman named Margaret, had always acted like she was untouchable. She was arrogant, self-righteous, and dismissive of anyone who challenged her. But this time, it was different. As I walked into the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of neighbors had come to watch, and they were all armed with questions, accusations, and anger. The room was packed, and I could see the tension in Margaret's eyes. She knew something was coming. I stepped up to the microphone, feeling my heart race in my chest. I could feel the eyes of the entire room on me, but I didn't falter. I had prepared for this moment. I had all the evidence ready, and I was going to expose Margaret for who she truly was. For too long, you have lied to this community, I began, my voice steady and strong. You've stolen from us. You've manipulated us. And you've used your position to further your own agenda. It ends today. As I laid out the evidence, bank statements, emails, meeting minutes, the room went silent. Margaret tried to interrupt, but the evidence was undeniable. Her lies fell apart piece by piece. Her face, once so confident, was now pale with fear. The residents had had enough. Their patience had run out, and they were demanding accountability. Margaret tried to salvage the situation, offering excuses and deflections, but it was too late. The truth had come out, and the community had seen it for themselves. The HOA was done. Margaret was forced to resign, and the board members who had supported her were voted out. The investigation continued, and it wasn't long before the authorities moved in. The financial misconduct was so severe that Margaret and her associates faced criminal charges. It was a swift and humiliating fall from power. The neighborhood began to heal. No longer were we at the mercy of a corrupt HOA that had treated us like pawns. The new board was transparent, accountable, and committed to serving the community, not themselves. The residents came together, stronger than before, and began working on projects to improve the neighborhood in a way that benefited everyone. It was a fresh start. As for me, I felt a mixture of relief and pride. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. The fall of the HOA wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for the entire community. We had taken back our home. The corrupt system that had once controlled our lives was gone. And we were free. The air was thick with tension. For months, we had been fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win, and yet here we were, standing at the precipice of victory. I had always been a firm believer in the justice system, but when I found myself up against an entity as powerful and corrupt as the Homeowners Association, HOA, I questioned everything I thought I knew. The battle we were waging was not just about fines, not just about rules, this was about fairness, transparency, and standing up to an institution that thought it could get away with anything. The HOA had been using its power to intimidate, fine, and bully the residents of our neighborhood. I had been one of the many victims, targeted by their relentless enforcement of minor violations, their arbitrary fees, and their refusal to answer basic questions about where our money was going. It had started with a simple fine for a minor infraction on my property, but soon, I realized that the problem was much larger. The HOA was abusing its power, controlling people through fear, and using its position to profit from residents who had nowhere to turn for help. But I wasn't going to let it stand. From the moment I realized what was happening, I knew I had to fight back. I began documenting every violation, every questionable fee, and every moment where the HOA had overstepped its bounds. I reached out to others in the community, finding more and more neighbors who had been wronged by the HOA's corrupt practices. Together, we formed a coalition, a group of residents committed to exposing the HOA for what it really was. We started by gathering evidence. I spent hours researching the HOA's bylaws, looking for inconsistencies and illegal clauses. I kept meticulous records of every communication, every fine, and every unexplained charge. I also gathered testimonies from residents who had been wronged, stories of unjust fines, unapproved repairs, and stolen funds. It was clear that the HOA had been running unchecked for far too long. But even with all this evidence, we knew we needed legal expertise to take on the HOA head-to-head. That's when we reached out to a lawyer who specialized in homeowners' rights and HOA abuses. His name was David, and he had seen cases like ours before. He understood the power dynamics at play, and he wasn't afraid to take on a big corporation. With his help, we filed a lawsuit against the HOA, demanding accountability for its actions. The first few weeks after filing were nerve-wracking. We had no idea how the HOA would respond, but we suspected they would do everything in their power to discredit us. They had deep pockets and a lot of influence, but we had something they didn't, the truth. And we weren't going to back down. As the lawsuit progressed, the HOA's tactics became clear. They tried to drag the case out, using every delay tactic they could think of. They filed motion after motion, hoping to wear us down. But we kept pushing forward. We gathered more evidence, more testimonies, and continued to press on. David, our lawyer, kept reminding us that the legal system wasn't always fast, but it was just. And eventually, the truth would prevail. The breakthrough came when we discovered a crucial piece of evidence. A set of financial records that showed the HOA had been siphoning money from the residents for years, using inflated repair costs and falsified invoices. It was a bombshell, a smoking gun that would expose the entire operation for what it truly was. We handed the evidence over to our lawyer, and he immediately filed for an expedited hearing. The day of the hearing arrived, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had led to this moment. The courtroom was packed, not with just the legal team, but with residents from the neighborhood who had come to support us. It felt like the entire community was standing together, united in the fight against a corrupt system that had tried to break us. When the judge called the case, I felt a wave of nervous energy wash over me. This was it. Our moment. David spoke first, laying out the evidence in a clear, concise manner. He explained how the HOA had systematically abused its power, how it had fined residents unfairly, and how it had used its influence to benefit a small group of people at the expense of the entire community. He didn't just present facts, he told the story of how the HOA had turned our neighborhood into a place of fear and distrust. And then, the key moment arrived. David presented the financial records, showing how the HOA had misappropriated funds and profited off its residents. The look of shock on the faces of the HOA representatives was priceless. They had no answer. No defense. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the HOA's practices. The HOA's lawyer tried to deflect, but it was clear they were losing ground. For the first time, it felt like the system was working for us, not against us. As the hearing progressed, I could see the shift in the room. The judge was taking our side, and it was becoming evident that the HOA would not escape unscathed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered the verdict. The HOA was found guilty of multiple violations, including financial misconduct, abuse of power, and unfair practices. The court ordered the HOA to refund the illegally collected fees and fines, and they were also instructed to reform their bylaws and practices. It was a legal victory of monumental proportions. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. The battle had been long, the stakes high, but we had won. The HOA was no longer the all-powerful force it once was. They had been held accountable for their actions, and justice had prevailed. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had suffered under their rule. In the days that followed, there was a palpable shift in the community. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now standing tall, proud of what we had accomplished together. The HOA's corrupt practices were no longer a shadow hanging over us, and we could finally breathe easy. But for me, the victory was more than just legal. It was a reminder that when people come together to fight for what's right, justice can, and will, prevail. The legal victory was just the beginning of a new chapter for our neighborhood. And for me, it was a testament to the power of perseverance, truth, and unity. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. My heart pounded in my chest, but I fought to maintain composure. The battle I had been waging for months was about to reach its climax, and there was no turning back now. The weight of the case, of the years of wrongdoing, was heavy, but today, I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a legal matter, it was about restoring balance, correcting the wrongs that had been inflicted upon us all. It had all started with the injustice I faced at the hands of the HOA. I had been the victim of unreasonable fines and regulations that seemed to be designed to control every aspect of my life. The HOA, once a seemingly innocuous group, had revealed its true nature: corrupt, power-hungry, and ruthless. They had abused their position, causing harm not just to me, but to dozens of others in the neighborhood. Their grip had been suffocating, their actions arbitrary, leaving many of us afraid to speak out. I knew I couldn't let it continue. So, I began the painstaking process of documenting every illegal fine, every unjustified charge, and every violation of their own rules. With each passing day, the evidence mounted, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA was not just enforcing rules, they were exploiting their residents. It was a revelation that only fueled my resolve. But the road ahead wasn't easy. The HOA had deep pockets, powerful connections, and a track record of bullying those who challenged them. When I first sought legal counsel, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Many believed taking on such a powerful entity was a fool's errand, but I refused to back down. I was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. Our legal team, led by the brilliant attorney, David, worked tirelessly. He believed in justice, in fairness, and in the power of a righteous cause. He was unwavering in his support, and soon we had a coalition of neighbors who, like me, were tired of the manipulation and injustice. Together, we presented our case, a comprehensive legal battle against an organization that thought it was untouchable. As the day of the trial approached, the anxiety became almost unbearable. The stakes were high, and the HOA wasn't going to go down without a fight. They hired the best lawyers, throwing everything they had at us: motions to dismiss, delays, and distractions. But we weren't backing down. With each legal maneuver, our resolve only hardened. We were on the side of truth, and that was all we needed. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. I could feel the tension in the air as the judge entered and the proceedings began. The HOA representatives were seated at one side, their faces unreadable, their posture arrogant. But I knew what they didn't. The truth was on our side, and the evidence was irrefutable. David opened the case by presenting our carefully gathered documentation. He laid out the facts clearly and concisely, how the HOA had been misusing its power to enforce fines for trivial reasons, how it had failed to maintain transparency with the residents, and how it had manipulated rules for its own benefit. The evidence was damning, and as the facts poured out, I saw the first cracks in the HOA's defense. The HOA's lawyer tried to counter, throwing out arguments about legal technicalities and trying to paint us as disgruntled residents who didn't understand the rules. But the more they spoke, the more their desperation showed. They didn't have the truth on their side. All they had were lies and loopholes, and they couldn't hide behind them for much longer. Then came the key moment. David introduced a series of financial records that exposed the HOA's fraudulent practices. We had uncovered payments made to unqualified contractors, inflated repair invoices, and, most shocking of all, evidence that the HOA had been funneling residents' fees into personal accounts. The room fell silent as the documents were presented. I could see the faces of the HOA representatives turn pale as the truth began to settle in. They had no answer. No defense. The judge, a seasoned professional, listened carefully, weighing the evidence. He asked pointed questions, and I could see that he wasn't easily swayed. But there was no denying the truth. We had laid bare the corruption, the negligence, and the exploitation. The only question now was how the HOA would be held accountable. After a long and tense deliberation, the judge finally rendered his verdict. He found the HOA guilty of multiple violations, financial misconduct, abuse of power, and negligence in their duties. The ruling was clear: the HOA would be required to refund the illegally collected fees, revise their bylaws, and undergo an audit of their financial activities. It was a resounding victory, not just for me, but for every resident who had been wronged. As the judge's gavel came down, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was a feeling of justice served, of righting the wrongs that had been done. For so long, the HOA had held all the power, making the lives of ordinary people miserable with their arbitrary rules and hidden agendas. But now, they had been exposed, and the system had worked. In the days that followed, the community began to breathe easier. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out were now coming forward, sharing their stories and their victories. The HOA's influence was shattered, and the trust that had been lost in our community was slowly being restored. People who had once lived in fear of reprisal were now speaking openly, empowered by the knowledge that justice had prevailed. For me, the victory wasn't just about the financial settlement or the legal triumph. It was about something deeper: the restoration of fairness, the return of a sense of security to our community, and the realization that when people come together to fight for what is right, justice can and will be served. The feeling of having taken on a corrupt system and come out victorious was indescribable. And in that moment, I knew that we had not just won a legal battle, we had reclaimed our power, our dignity, and our community.